Today's topic is titled Feminism and the Concept of Medina and is part of the series of the Guiding Lamps for Muslim Women. Inshallah, we are honoured today to have Ustadha Zara Faris joining us as our guest speaker. Zara is an international speaker, a researcher and debater for the Muslim Debate Initiative. She is a graduate in Arabic and Islamic Studies from SOAS University. Alhamdulillah, she's delivered many talks and she's taken part in this topic of Islam and feminism. And I'm sure you are all as intrigued as I am to learn about the prophetic model so that we can learn how to advocate for women's rights without feminism, which is also Sister Zara's motto, which I found out, to call for women's rights without feminism. And at the end, inshallah, we'll have time for questions or comments, or if you want to say anything as well, inshallah, or if you want any clarifications, inshallah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Jazakallah khair to all of you for coming today. I know it's the summer months and people are generally going a bit slower with maybe holidays from university or work and spending time with family. So it's really nice and wonderful that you're here. Inshallah, we'll all be rewarded and we'll get something good out of this. So the title, as Sister Nasima has mentioned, is Feminism and the Concept of Medina. And for many people, the part of this title that was particularly intriguing, if feminism is not already intriguing, is the concept of Medina. So I'm going to start by briefly talking about our role as Muslims as problem solvers and what's required of us. Then I'm going to talk about feminism specifically. I'm going to talk specifically not only about Western secular feminism, but also Islamic feminism, because that seems to be an area that doesn't really get touched on too much. And I'm going to go into the substance of what some of those writers and thinkers really have to say on the topic. Now, if Islam is the solution to all human problems, which is what, as Muslims, we believe, then being a Muslim is not about being a passive human being, it's about solving problems. So if somebody has an injury or has a grievance, it's our duty to help them resolve that problem. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, says that even to remove an obstacle from the road, that doesn't necessarily affect you. Removing something from the road constitutes an act of charity because you've solved a problem for someone else. Even smiling, to lift someone's mood is an act of charity because it's a small problem, although it may be a problem, but it's something that may be resolved and lightened. Something so small as a smile. More than a voluntary act of charity, however, we are commanded as Muslims to find cures for sicknesses, to try to alleviate genuine and hefty plights of our brothers and sisters, whether it's to do with money, whether it's to do with oppression, whatever it is to do with. And this is not a voluntary act of charity, but rather an obligation that we all have. We are charged with that responsibility and we are rewarded for, inshallah, helping to alleviate that and to solve those problems. But what is the prerequisite for any problem solving? To solve a problem, it sounds basic and simple, but it's actually very important. We have to understand the reality that we're dealing with. We have to understand what our purpose of Muslims is on earth, which is to bear witness to the truth of the Creator and what His laws are that solve those problems. We're not here just to bear witness and say that here are the laws and here are the solutions, but we're here to also employ them to establish justice and mercy for all members of society. And this is not just to help other Muslims, but it's also where we can help people of other faiths and other religions. It's our duty to help them as well. Many of us know the examples, for example, of when Muslims have been in positions of ability and power, have without question helped people of other nations. For example, the Ottomans who helped the Irish during the terrible famine of 1848 when no one else was willing to help them, even though diplomatically it may not have been a wise thing for them to do, but they didn't care about that. All they thought about was, as Muslims, we have the resources and the help. Others are not helping, we'll help. And they sent lots of resources. That's just one quick example. So it's not just trying to help ourselves or our own Muslim community. It's about setting an example and equipping ourselves to help others as well. And to do this is not simply a case of rote learning a series of facts or a series of rights, or knowing the list of who is owed what, that leads to success in this area. It doesn't mean that to learn, you know, as I said, a list of facts makes you succeed in that area. For example, I can't rote learn a list of historical facts and then claim to be an historian. I need to know not just what those facts are, but I need to know how to process those details. I need to know the wider context. I need to know how to analyze and make sense of those historical events. And in the same way, for example, if you're not historically inclined and you're more scientifically inclined, knowledge of biology. Knowledge of biology is different from knowing how to research biology. I can pick up a book and learn some biological facts. Fine, that doesn't make me a biologist. Unless I know how to carry out the techniques and the methods for discovering new knowledge about biology, make improvements to biology, and even research new techniques, only then can someone call themselves a biologist. Now, similarly, as Muslims, we have to understand the Islamic solutions for leading a life. And that doesn't simply mean knowing the list of what is and what is not. To address the problems around us, for example, if particular problems that relate specifically to the rights of women, for example, we can't just have a list of, well, this is not right because we have the right to do X, Y, and Z. Rather, we need to know not just what the rights are, but how to actually structure family life, how to structure wider social interactions, how to establish government that is accountable for all its doings that affect those things from there on, how to best distribute resources, how best a person can carry themselves through their manners, how to worship, how to care for the environment, and so on. It's all about the how, not just the what or the why. And as Muslims, our primary source of guidance for this how is, of course, the Quran. Then we have the Hadith, and then the other two sources of Islamic law, Ijma', social consensus, and Qiyas, analogy. We're going to be focusing on the Quran for the purposes of this discussion, and we'll touch on some Hadith as well. Now, generally speaking, some of you may also be familiar when it comes to the Quran and the different types of verses that were revealed. Generally, they are categorized into the Makki verses and the Madani verses. The Makki verses being those which were believed or understood to have been revealed in Mecca, and the Madani, those which are believed to have been revealed in Medina. And one of the differences, generally speaking, between these two categorizations is that the Makki verses, the ones revealed in the early days of Islam, they were more about the why. They were more about Tawheed, the oneness of God, the hereafter, the purpose of life. Why do we serve Allah? Why are we here? They were more about the reasons for our existence. They weren't necessarily about the details of how we live our lives. The Madani verses, the verses revealed in Medina, on the other hand, tend to be much longer. There are fewer of them, and the reason for their length is because they were more legal in their detail. There were very specific legal details about how we live our lives. And they were, the Makki verses were a lot shorter, and they were a lot more poetic, because when Islam first came, it came to a people who were enamored by poetry, who were impressed by poetry. The verses were obviously the most beautiful poetry they had ever encountered. It was sort of a gateway to bring them to an understanding of Islam. The Madani verses, you'll find, are less poetic. They are a little bit more like legal texts. And it's interesting that, and this brings us on to the concept of Medina. The Madani verses tended to be more legal because they were setting up a new society. This is after they had left Mecca and were emigrating to find a place of peace where they could set up an Islamic society. And these Madani verses began to be revealed. And it's interesting if you consider the etymology of the word Medina. It also has origins in Aramaic, where Medina originally meant a town that lived under a particular court. And even in Arabic, Medina, the root is from the word deen. And there's two roots that have deen. One of them is to be to denote a way of life, and the other one is more to do with judging and governing. This is why we have Yawm ad-Din, the day of judgment. If you open Handswear Dictionary, for example, any of you that are familiar with Arabic, you'll see Deen is da, ya, and nun, and it's listed twice, and there's two different. It's the same triliteral root, but there's two different meanings for this at origin. And the Madani verses tended to be legal, and at the same time, deen, way of life, was also, and also the derivative meaning of to be judged or to be governed. It gives the sense that people attain civilized conduct through regulations and laws. So in a way, the idea of civilizing, of settling down, of creating a society is through law and regulation. And it's not through liberation from law that we attain that civilization, but it's liberation through the law that we attain that civilization. So the word Medina, for that reason, is particularly interesting, and the Prophet ﷺ changed the name of the city Yathrib to Medina. Didn't just leave it as Yathrib, but there are accounts that said, by renaming the city, the implication was that this area or the religion of Islam will be experienced or manifested in that place as a whole, as a complete. And it's interesting, the concept of liberation through the law. There are also interesting Roman personalities, for example Cicero, who said that we are in bondage to the law in order that we may be free. And so generally throughout different historical narratives, bondage to the law or adhering to law was considered a path to I don't like the word liberation necessarily, and I'll explain why later, but it was a path to correct living. The concept of Medina is also interesting because some of you may have heard of the Charter of Medina, which can be, or the Dastur, or it has a few different names, but it can be described as one of the first agreements in human history that would facilitate a certain relationship amongst people. It was also signed in Medina. So, for example, well, more specifically, the Charter of Medina was renowned as being the Islamic legal document or contract that facilitated different ethnic and religious groups to negotiate their rights and responsibilities with each other without resorting to the use of power against each other instead. So essentially, Medina and the concept of Medina epitomizes the socio-political order of Islam. And this is key in establishing a solution to many of the problems that we have today. Surah Al-Baqarah was one of the verses revealed in Medina. When you look at the details of it, you'll see it is very long. It may not have the same sort of poetic or rhythmic patterns as the Makki verses. And it contains a lot of detailed provisions, not just about women, but all kinds of areas of life, but including some of the provisions on women. So, for example, verse 228 states that women shall have rights similar to the rights against them according to what is equitable. It's just one example of how it starts to, I suppose, not similar to, but in the same vein as the Charter of Medina, starts to establish mutual rights and responsibilities between what may be considered people of society that may have different needs from one another. Now, on the specific issue of women, so that is a bit more general on our purpose as Muslims and our purpose in how we resolve problems. On the specific issue of women, we have to really get to grips with the idea that, and sometimes you see this failing when people are having their discussions about this topic, that there is an interconnectedness in Islam between one person's rights, regardless of whether they're male or female, and the duties of another person or the duties of an entire community. So, for example, between the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak, the teachers and the students. As we'll see later, I'll explain a little bit further, but the right of one person can only exist if another person has a duty to uphold that right. Specifically, while Islam provides rights for women in a profound and insightful formulation, The rights of any person in Islam, as I said, it is incumbent upon others fulfilling their duties, not just in one industry, but in every arena of life, which is why Islam has a holistic model, not just a piecemeal model. So the right, for example, for a Muslim woman to manage her own economic affairs. Many of us know of this. I'm not going to go into the basic details of women's property rights, for example. But the right for a Muslim woman to manage her own economic affairs and to be provided for depends on the duty that a male relative would have to provide for her. That's pretty simple. But to extend it further, we have to consider that her right to be provided for becomes a pipe dream in situations of poverty. If there's a situation of poverty overall, how can the husband, even if he wants to provide, how can he provide? And therefore, the rights of the woman are also not fulfilled. This is just to show the interconnectedness and the domino effect of these problems. Similarly, the right to obtain legal remedies in the event of divorce or marital discord. This depends on the duty of those that are in authority, so those who are the judges in the situation, or the advisors or the mediators. It depends on their duty to manage people's affairs with justice, to manage it justly. And again, this becomes almost impossible where there's a lack of any Islamic authority at all. There's the lack of any relevant courts to hear such complaints. So your rights cannot be fulfilled in a vacuum. You cannot simply have your rights fulfilled without all those other things also being corrected and put into place. The right to go out and seek knowledge, which Islam has never restricted for any human being. The right to go out and seek knowledge depends on the duty of those who are more learned, to convey what they have learned. So not only is it a duty on teachers to share their knowledge and not hoard whatever they have learned, but also this becomes a hazard, and it becomes almost impossible if, for example, the streets are filled with violence or fear or war. How can you then satisfy or pursue your duty as a Muslim even to seek knowledge when it's unsafe to even go out on the streets, or when you're too busy trying to scrape together a living to have any time to enhance yourselves intellectually? So all these things are connected. In any Muslim society, whether it is Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Arab world, or even a sub-society here in England, in any Muslim society, the lack of implementation of women's rights is a glaring piece of evidence, it's a symptom, that society overall is not functioning on the correct principles. It's not again a problem in a vacuum, it's a symptom of a wider problem for some of the reasons that I mentioned. And it pervades all aspects of society. Now, this is the result of there being an imbalance in society. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes in the Quran in a beautiful verse, Surah Ar-Rahman, which itself is full of balance. When you read it, the way that it flows is just perfectly balanced and it's just wonderful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes this balance in relation to the heavens and also in relation to our duties as human beings. In English, from verse 5 to 9, He has taught him, in other words, He's taught mankind speech and intelligence. The sun and the moon move by precise calculation, and the herbs and the trees both alike prostrate in adoration. And the heaven He raised and imposed the balance, in order that ye may not transgress the due balance. So establish weight with justice and fall not short in the balance. The word used is al-mizan, which means nothing, it means balance. So balance is one of the key concepts in ensuring a harmonious, or as harmonious as possible, existence for us as human beings. So allamahu al-bayan, ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bihusban, wal-najmu wal-shajaru yasjudan, was-sama'a rafa'aha wa wada'aha al-mizan, alla tatghaw fil mizan, وَأَقِيمُوا الْوَزْنَ بِالْقِسْطِ وَلَا تُخْسِرُوا الْمِيزَانِ. So that word is repeated throughout. It's all about the measure and the scale, whether it's the heavens or whether it's how we balance our duties. So I hope we've established so far that rights come from duties. And merely demanding our rights alone is not enough. Rather, we should be seeking ways to ensure that each part of the ummah is fulfilling its respective duties. Now, from this balance, and it was the word mizan. It wasn't the word, it wasn't promising heaven. It wasn't promising utopia. Rather, as one of my colleagues helpfully put it, it offers an optopia. In other words, a society where things are calibrated in the optimum way possible. So it may not be perfect, but it's actually the best balance that mankind, in its imperfect nature, can achieve through following God's pattern. One particular narration that is very revealing in how we manage this issue is the Prophet ﷺ was describing it as the people in the top and bottom of a boat. So I mentioned earlier that you have the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak, the educated and the learned, those with and those with less. And the Prophet ﷺ said that the example of the person abiding by Allah's order and restrictions in comparison to those who violate them is like the example of those persons who drew lots for their seat in a boat. So there's a boat. Like in life, we don't know what we're going to get. We don't choose necessarily all of our strengths or all of our weaknesses. We get what we get, right? So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying that, this is like we're drawing lots for seats in a boat. Some of them got seats in the upper part and others in the lower. So perhaps you could consider this as the rich in the upper part or the strong in the upper part, and you may have certain elements of your life where you are considered to be in the upper part, and in other elements you are in the lower part. It's not necessarily saying that some people are always in the top and some are always in the bottom, but the narration goes on. When those in the lower part of the boat, so they are inside in the base of the boat, when they needed water to drink, they had to go up to bring water, and that troubled the others, that troubled the ones on the top. So the ones in the lower part said, I'm paraphrasing now, by the way. They said, let's not make a hole, let's not bother them. Obviously it's too much hassle for them. Let's make a hole in our part of the boat, and then, we can get water for ourselves, and they won't have to worry about it. We won't have to trouble them anymore. And the narration goes on. If the people in the upper part let those in the lower part do what they had suggested, in other words, if the people in the upper boat let those down below drill holes in the boat, then everybody would have been destroyed because the whole ship would have drowned. But if they had prevented them, then both parties would be safe. And so what the Prophet ﷺ is describing is a situation in which those who have the upper hand or have an advantage in society have a duty to ensure that those who are in need of their assistance are not neglected, and that those who are in need of their assistance don't feel shy about demanding what Allah has apportioned for them. And if they do neglect them and push them to the point where they start drilling holes in the bottom of the boat, it's not just those in the bottom or who are disadvantaged who will suffer, it is all of us, whether it's in this life as a result of the material actions, or whether it's in the next life, because we are all going to be accountable for whatever advantage we have. And I think that particular narration is quite powerful in explaining or visualizing the actual situation that we are in at the moment. So the solution for the lack of rights of the people on the lower deck is not that everybody should get a drill for their part of the boat. That's madness. Rather, it's about the people on the top fulfilling their duties, and this is where our campaigns or our work needs to focus. And to do this, we need to take time not only to understand the Islamic solutions, but also to understand and why part of the reason why we're here today, but it's also to understand other belief systems and worldviews, including feminism. And we need to observe how these other systems approach the same problems and what's the reason for this. Now, if we're going to invite another person to follow Islam or to even practice Islam if they're already a Muslim, and to practice its solutions holistically, then we need to be able to explain why these solutions are better than other worldviews and how these other worldviews can be problematic. we know that we learn more from, well, often we can learn more from others' mistakes rather than our own successes. The Quran, for example, frequently highlights the mistakes of other peoples of the past. Why does it do that? It does that so that we don't make the same mistakes. Similarly, as Muslims, we need to have a proper understanding of the shortcomings, for example, of feminism and the inaccuracies and contradictions. Are there any? What are they? How harmful are they? Is it just, can we still use the terminology as a benign force for good? We need to understand all of this in order to fulfill our roles as Muslims, as problem solvers, and in order to offer and implement better solutions. Now, very briefly, what is the cause of all these injustices that we're seeing in the world today? Now, we see, for example, if we look over to the East, social injustice that's faced not just by women, but by men and children. It's carnage, it's chaos. The injustice that's faced by both men and women in the post-colonial Muslim world today, it's plain to see. I wouldn't say a domino effect of oppression. I would say it's a ricochet effect of oppression, because it's just from all sides, and it's without right. Well, it has a reason, but it's not necessarily just one oppressing another, oppressing another, oppressing another. It's all going at it right now, and it's recognized that this is not due to the implementation of Islamic rights, because we can see they're not being implemented. But it's due to the continued absence of this. It's not just that it doesn't exist now, but it continues to not exist, and we continue to not do anything about that. Now, a very, very detailed diagnosis of the situation in the Muslim world is probably for another day or another session. But very briefly, we can see that, by way of summary, the Muslim world presently is exhibiting the traumas of a post-colonial amputation of the holistic wisdom of Islamic texts from the education system. So there are many accounts of colonialists in the Muslim world changing the way the education system works, so that Muslims are no longer pursuing or even getting a basic understanding of the laws of Islam, but rather it's separated into, that's just religious studies, you can do it after school with your Maulvi Saab or something like that. And this secularization of education is one of the causes of the shallow and superficial understanding of Islam that currently tends to is predominant in the Muslim world today. The way that Islam was classically understood, it's a distant memory, and this is what's giving rise to injustices against both, against all. And it's a sad state of affairs when we are, to our religion as archaeologists, we are chipping away to try to find nuggets here and there. How was this dealt with? How was that dealt with? And this should all be alive. This knowledge should be alive. It should be living with us. But rather, we have to look at it as though through glass in a museum. We don't even know where to begin often. It's just, you get a bit from here, someone has a bit here, someone has a bit there. It's not systematic. Mashallah, there seems to be a little upturn, at least here in London, of sisters studying and becoming, studying to become scholars and to become alimat, and that's fantastic. But we'll get more into that shortly. Now, this shallow thinking, this kind of poverty of thought, it's caused some people to look over to the other countries and say, well, for example, I was in Pakistan recently, and you have people of all sorts. You have people that are very rich, you have people that are very poor, you have periods of no electricity, even though you have every other modernity. You have Wi-Fi better than you have in London. You can go out there to, a very outback post of nowhere and still have more bars than you tend to have in London. But it's very strange. It's really advanced, and at the same time, it's really lost. You'll have, a shop selling cronuts and weird lattes and rolled up ice cream done on the spot, and right in front you have a beggar sitting in a bowl with no legs, pulling himself along. It's just this really weird, paradox of what's going on. And so those people who are downtrodden in those societies, they look over to the West and they say, well, those people have water, they have food, they have electricity, they have clothes, they have somewhere to live, they have school, their way of life must be good. I'm going to imitate that way of life. And this shallow thinking, or this poverty of thought, that has caused this degradation in the Muslim world, it's caused some of them to want to imitate the life of their former colonizers, which they see are now doing very well across the pond or wherever. And in particular, it's the ideology, whether they realize it or not, or whether it is packaged as this or not. But a lot of this comes from secular liberalism and its offshoot of gender feminism. And it's in this milieu that people are now seeking to articulate feminism through the medium of Islam, through the language of Islam, and some are even trying to propose and advocate the notion of, and we'll come into why this is a contradiction later, but of a feminist Islam. I would point out that, like colonialism, however, feminism is not the primary cause, it's not the first cause of our problems today. Rather, it's the inevitable unwanted repercussion of our failings, and it serves only to compound our problems further. Now, it wasn't just our failure to defend Allah's model and way of life in the first place, but also our continued failure to collectively maintain a sound ideological basis for our beliefs in the first place. And the reason I say it's not the primary cause is because it happened. How did we allow it to happen in the first place? But it is a problem. It is a repercussion that makes our problems worse. It exacerbates the situation. And hopefully, through reviving the ideological basis and Allah's model for how we should be living, will challenge the root problem at the very beginning. Now, there are some who advocate through this a reformation of Islam, who consider Islam to be, the subject of their own imported solutions. So let Islam be treated with secular liberalism. There are some who advocate this kind of solution, and there are others who advocate the revival of the classical understanding of Islam by way of solution. And they consider Islam as the object. This is the solution. It's not something that needs to be treated itself. And I would just point out as well that the matter of women's rights has never been, and we shouldn't let it be considered to have been the exclusive remit of feminists. It's not their topic. Women's rights does not belong to feminists. Questioning feminism, as we will do, and its methods, is not tantamount to questioning whether women's rights need to be safeguarded. These are different things. The amount of times these things have been conflated, leading to, absolutely balmy discussions simply from this small point, is quite amazing. And it's not, and nor is it tantamount, which some people seem to think, that if you are about to criticize feminism, that you are inviting injustice upon women. Unfortunately, feminism hasn't been able to protect women from the injustices that they claim, and so it's not tantamount to inviting injustice upon women merely to criticize feminism or to even question it. Now, very briefly, why is it important that we get this right, if we don't already know? Why is it important that we don't adopt the wrong solutions? Now, to some people, they would explain that women end up as feminists because they're forced to do so out of desperation. I've heard this quite a lot. So-and-so produced this kind of rap video because they were forced to do so out of desperation. So-and-so expressed themselves in this way because they were forced to do out of desperation. Now, this is actually an excuse that denies the agency and accountability of the women in question. And moreover, it's rather ironic defense of feminism to say that feminists just can't help themselves. That's essentially what they're saying, which is one of the main things that feminists would rail against. They would rail against being told that, they are unthinking or that they are doing things without purpose. And yet some people want to defend them by saying they can't help themselves. And if I were a feminist, which thankfully I'm not, I'd be doubly offended by that. Alhamdulillah. So the reason this is important is because sisters who feel that they are forced to do so, apart from the substance of feminism, which we're going to come to, This doesn't make you, if you feel oppressed, you are still accountable as a Muslim. The oppressed do not become exempt from accountability in the sight of Allah. So Allah doesn't excuse one that's hard done by from their own questioning on the Day of Judgment. You don't get a free pass just because somebody harmed you. It doesn't give you license to do whatever you want. Being oppressed doesn't give one class the license to inflict injustice against another class, or to even assert some kind of inherent superiority over members of another class. So, for example, in his last sermon, when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ stated that the only superiority was by piety and good action, he didn't say that superiority was based on whether you had been oppressed or whether you are of a particular gender or whether you're of a particular colour. It was by piety and good action, irrespective of your demographic. Being a member of an oppressed class doesn't suddenly mean we're exempt from our life purpose, which is to serve Allah through righteousness and through His method, and to do what we can for justice and accountability. And there's a very interesting conversation that Allah reveals in the subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals in the Holy Quran, and it follows the conversation between one who is weak, one who was made weak, so we could say the oppressed, so the one who was weakened by another, and this individual's conversation with another who was overbearing or arrogant, or who was the oppressor. And in this verse, both those parties have been condemned in the hereafter. So the verse says, but if you could see when the wrongdoers, so both of them are called zalimun, they're both called wrongdoers, but if you could see when the wrongdoers are made to stand before their Lord, refuting each other's words, those who were held weak will say to those who were overbearing, if it weren't for you, we would have been believers. We would have done the right thing, in other words. And those who are overbearing will say to those who are weak, well, did we avert you from guidance after it had come to you? You were the criminals. So they're both pointing at each other's wrongdoing. And in this verse, two groups will wrangle with each other while standing before their Creator. And the oppressed group is trying to blame the overbearing, and the overbearing will turn around and remind the oppressed that despite being oppressed, they could have still followed divine guidance in their own behavior. And some may think then that this leaves no recourse. Oh, so, I can't call myself a feminist. Well, then there's no solution. This is what some people think. I've actually heard people, say this, that, oh, if I can't call myself a feminist, then what do I do? As though that is the only solution that has been presented to humanity. Of course, there is recourse, and Islam is, and as we'll look at, is rich in its solutions as to how to rectify the situation. And Islam deals with injustice not just by prohibiting one injustice on a case-by-case basis, but it tries to prohibit each and every unjust act, regardless of who does it or who it's done to. And in this way, injustice is stamped out without any feelings of residual rancor or injustice. So it's not that you were unjust to B and now B can be unjust to you, because it's just going to be this continuing, it's just going to be a continuation of what was before. Rather, Islam tries to deal with it in a way that nobody is left feeling that they are then hard done by, and people can actually just feel that, things are how they should be. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, O you who believe, stand out firmly for Allah and be just witnesses. Let not the enmity and hatred of others make you avoid justice. And no matter how angry you may be at someone who you believe is oppressing you, you cannot avoid doing or behaving with justice or behaving in the right way. The verse goes on, be just, that is nearer to piety. Remember, the Prophet ﷺ said the best are those who are pious and fear Allah. Verily, Allah is well acquainted with what you do. Another verse which it develops this even further. O you who have believed, be persistently standing firm in justice, witnesses for Allah, even if it be against yourselves or your parents or your relatives. Whether one is rich or poor, Allah is more worthy of both. So follow not your personal inclinations, lest you not be just. And if you distort, i.e. your testimony, or you refuse to give your testimony, then indeed Allah is ever with what you do acquainted. This idea of be witnesses and stand firm, even if it is against yourselves. When I talk about later the way that sometimes feminists have created classes of people, that women are one class and we must back women no matter what they're saying or doing, just remember this verse which says, stand for justice, even if you think it is you're standing for justice against your own kind, whatever that may be, because justice is the only path that will actually result in the right solutions. So just bear this particular verse in mind as we go forward. Now we're starting to get to the meat of feminism. And as an entryway to that, I want to talk about, I mentioned earlier that the word liberation doesn't always sit quite right with me. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that it's a word that is used by every single group and movement that is jostling for its own rights and territory today. They want liberation, 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 liberation. And everyone is talking endlessly and passionately about liberation for themselves, or even imposing liberation on others sometimes. But few talk about what the word itself actually means. What do they need to be liberated from? If all these different competing factions need to be liberated, what do they all need to be liberated from? Do those things even coincide? What do they need to be liberated to? It doesn't explain or diagnose the wider situation or explain anything about the landscape in which they're vying for their rights. And even fewer people question the basis of their concept of liberation, despite the number of people that are actually using this word. And I've even used it in the past, but recently I've been thinking about it, and the more that we'll talk about language shortly, but language is incredibly important in how we achieve and frame our arguments. Now, if by liberation people mean freedom from external influences, so for example our environment, like the weather or the climate or things like this, or things that are around us, then this is impossible, because unless we're created outside of the universe, which we are not, human beings are shaped and limited by their environments. So, for example, our families, societies, the climate, all of this is part of the external atmosphere or the influences that are, we can't really be liberated from those things. They exist, they affect us. And if by liberation people mean freedom from internal influences, so for example our human nature or genetics, then this is also absurd, because we are defined by those factors of our human nature. For example, whether it is our genetics or whether it is the human instinct to eat or sleep. These are things, again, we can't be liberated from. So the real question, therefore, is not whether we can attain liberation from either these internal or these external influences, but the question is, what influences should we embrace as helpful and what influences should we reject as harmful? We can't eliminate influences altogether, but it's about understanding how we should live with these influences, and how do we determine this? And are we seeking, so-called liberation for just a few people, or rather than liberation, are we actually seeking guidance for a collective society? Are we actually seeking to know the best way to live? And this can only be answered by examining the purpose of humans, which is what Islam does, and which is what Islam explains to us, for example, in particular, as I mentioned earlier, the Makki verses, where it explains to humankind the reason for existence, and a lot more. And no movement or no ideology can offer relief from these distresses without knowing what human purpose actually is. Otherwise, it's just blindly feeling in the dark with no end goal in sight, no defined framework with which to identify what is good and what is bad. It just becomes a matter of personal opinion. Now, currently in generally what is called Western culture and civilization, currently it's based on, or frequently understood to be based on, the dogma of individualism. And feminism is a subset of this. I'll explain why shortly. But individualism makes the assumption that human beings, and I'm summarizing this heavily, making the assumption that human beings are merely individuals with no purpose except to exist as individuals, to do what pleases you. However, humans, as I mentioned some of these external and internal influences earlier, humans, like cells in the body, we aren't merely individuals. We can't exist apart from one another. We're social creatures. We're defined to some extent by society, though we have decisions on how much we let that affect us. We're defined by a culture, parents, genetics, the languages we're taught as babies, as children growing up. We don't have a say in that. We can't learn language without being taught by another. Anybody that studied the phenomenon of feral individuals or feral children who don't learn the ability to speak in the early years, they can never learn it, and they can never learn to think properly. And these are things which we depend on other people for. We don't live as isolated atoms in society. And we're creatures that have many instinctive needs, and they can only be fulfilled by other people. And this is why solitary confinement, for example, in prisons, it's one of the most inhumane punishments. It's one of the most frightening punishments for inmates in prisons. The idea of solitary confinement, they would rather be in an environment with other criminals than be left alone without any stimuli and any other person to be with. Now, humans, as I mentioned earlier, we were created in the universe. It sounds really obvious, and it is obvious. We were created in this universe with our genetics and with our nature, and we did not create the universe. We were not the ones creating all of this. We are subject to this, and there's no escaping that. And these realities, this all reflects the higher truth that we are part of. And it's actually individuals claim to put the individual above these realities, to make out as though we can do whatever we want, is actually orphaning humans from this higher purpose. It separates us from that understanding of our higher purpose, that we are subjects of God. We didn't create God. And in doing so, this kind of liberation, by putting the individual above all of this, it renders lives meaningless, and it renders lives vulnerable to oppression by the vanities of those who happen to be strong in human society. So the question then is, does feminism offer a purpose for women? And can it really claim to understand what women who are part of the human species actually need? As Muslims, as I said, we know that Islam does this. Does feminism do this? Now, feminism, as I mentioned, is based on individualism. And it claims that it too wants to free the individual, i.e. free women, from all imposing influences. Imposing influences meaning particularly God, culture and society, including gender roles. And it will package these all up as patriarchy. And they claim that they want to free women from this, all in the name of individual freedom. Unfortunately, feminism as an ideology lacks any concrete idea about human purpose, and consequently how humans, or more specifically female humans, should be living. So simply saying, as feminists often do, that women can do as they wish and give themselves their own meaning is as pointless as a dictionary without definition. As Muslims, we know what we have to live with meaning, otherwise what is the purpose of life? Whereas these ideologies don't have an explanation for that. And in offering women no valid purpose or meaning, and I'll give an example of this, but it actually leaves women more open to the vagaries and capriciousness of a lot of the social forces that are responsible for many of the problems in the first place. So feminism isn't liberating women from this base causality, rather it's just leaving the way for new social pressures to be created, constituting new forms of oppression against women. And essentially, feminism becomes endless resistance with no end goal, with no end vision, because it doesn't have a framework with which to depict that in the first place. An example of this is that many feminists, and not all, but some feminists, they have different factions on this, but a particular faction of feminists will advocate that women should be able to wear whatever they want and reject any social norms of propriety. And this opened, essentially Pandora's box of female exploitation. fashion and media industry, turning women into one-dimensional objects for mass consumerism. There's countless studies of social pressures of beauty causing the rise of eating disorders, not just amongst women and girls, but also men and boys, because it's become something that has pervaded society so deeply, so much so that labiaplasty has become one of the fastest growing forms of cosmetic surgery in the US and the UK. Not the fast, but one of the most fast, either the second or the third. And it's to the point where women hate their own bodies to that extent. Now, although some feminists, this is just an example, by the way, although some feminists recognize these social pressures, they don't know exactly how to challenge it without compromising the dogma of individual freedom that created that in the first place. So on one hand, it's express your individuality by dressing however you want, but at the same time, it's that particular individual freedom that has created the problem in the first place. So it's a vicious cycle, and it's because they don't have a yardstick for what is the right level and why is that the right level. I remember seeing not recently, it was a couple of years ago, but one woman had started a campaign to revive the classical, more the vintage style of swimwear on the beach, where it was more covered, but it was still a swimsuit. And I wondered why she had picked that period in particular. Why that period? Why not further back? Why not further back? Why not this period? Why that particular period? There was no reason. It was just personal choice. So it becomes up to the whims of the human mind as to what might be good and what might not be good, as opposed to having an objective criteria for why it is a certain level of covering, and how to exactly why it is that level and what the hikmah is behind that level. And it's not something that we can determine through trial and error. So there's this ideological void that this individual freedom creates. It's an ideological void where anything can come and play, basically. Any sort of ideology can come and set up camp and dictate things from there on in. And it's in this ideological void that, paradoxically, it's very strange and ironic, but most feminists will adopt or have adopted imitation. Making men and male roles the object of emulation, making that the yardstick for what they should be doing, and making gender the lens through which any situation in life should be analysed. And this lens, as a slight detour, a very interesting one, has been subtly responsible for how we view women of history as well. Now, when we look at the women of, or when we think about the women of pre-Islamic Arabia, there's actually, historians would say there's very little that you can know for sure about how they lived. There are different accounts of, maybe depending on what class of society you were at, that would affect how your life was, whether it was advantageous, whether it was not advantageous. There's different narrations, there's different opinions about what life was like. But to consider that, I think that the word oppressed, or to say that they were oppressed, it presumes automatically a class system whereby the women of pre-Islamic Arabia were deliberately oppressed just because they were women. In other words, what feminists would call misogyny. Or were they women that, along with other members of society, happened to be the victims of an unguided existence? And I'll explain what I mean. Now, Khadija radiallahu anha was a powerful businesswoman, self-assured, independent. She sought, to pursue a proposal herself. And this was before the advent of Islam. She doesn't sound like, mashallah, she didn't sound like a downtrodden or oppressed or even a weak-willed individual. She sounded like she pretty much knew what she was doing with her life. And the early converts, female converts, including those who emigrated with the Prophet ﷺ, they were robust in their convictions and resilient in the threats that they faced. They didn't just do what their husbands wanted them to do. They had the strength and the fortitude to do that. They weren't meek or weak wallflowers. They had to be strong to do that. They had to have that in them, at least. Consider alternatively on the side the Battle of Uhud, where many women were sent along with the forces to rile up the anger of those who are fighting. Consider Hind. She didn't sound like much of a wallflower. She didn't sound very meek or downtrodden or oppressed. And again, some of this may have been due to class. Some of this may have just been due to the fact that in a tribal society, there is no set rule for how people are. It's just about, power balance, whether that's within the family, whether it's between clans, whether it's between tribes. There was no overall legal system of how society should live. It was, tribally and clan-based. They may have had chiefs discussing and coming to agreements, but essentially it was a power struggle. It was a power balance all the time. And so for some, they may have been oppressed. For some, they may have been dominant. There are even some historians that have noted that some other women during that time were actually very free in terms of their relationships with men, and it said that some of them had the option to dictate a monogamous marriage if they wanted to. So for those who are looking from a liberal perspective, they may say that, oh yeah, they were not oppressed. They were doing fine by our standards. So we have to be careful when we just automatically categorize, oh, these women were oppressed. Rather, it is more helpful to remember that rather than describing them as being oppressed or subservient, although that may have been the case in many instances, to see them as the whole of society, in the word that Islam has used for a long time, which is jahil, ignorant. They didn't know either way whether this was right or wrong. This was just how they were. This was just the way that they were living. It's a state of being almost oblivious. But when we say they were oppressed, if we say they're oppressed, we are setting a certain, we are using a certain framework. If a liberal historian will say they are oppressed, they may be using a different set of goalposts than us. So we have to be very precise with our language when we talk about or when we think about the lives of men and women before Islam. This is why the word jahil or ignorant is actually the best word, because they may not have felt oppressed even though they were. They may have felt that this is just the way things are. Some of them may have even capitalized or exploited that situation to the best of their ability. Oppressed is a word that we have now started to use a lot, along with liberated. And it's not always the most precise word. It's not to say that people were not oppressed, but it's not the word that is necessarily the correct diagnosis for what was going on. And it also reminds us that it wasn't just society wasn't wrong because men were deliberately targeting women as their targets. Rather, the target for most people in such a society would be to attain power. Whoever they hurt along the way is just collateral. That's not the actual objective. The objective is to attain power, to keep your needs and security being fulfilled in society. And whether it's the poor or the weak or whoever, it's a state of haphazardry. It's a slow playing chaos that results in clans vying for power to ensure their security. So there were necessarily victims, but it's not that they were. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were targeted. Do you see what I mean? It's not, and this is a problem when people tend to throw around the word, and I'll come to this more later, but throw around the word misogyny, which means the deliberate targeting of women merely because they're women. And as I'll explain later, I think that's letting people off a little too lightly, because if you say that someone is merely a misogynist, that's not as bad as saying that they are failing to uphold the laws of Allah, which is, in my mind, that's much more worse and much more powerful way to hopefully, get people on the right track. I think calling them misogynists is giving them an easy ride. Whereas if you point out their failure to uphold what Islam says, what worse indictment could there be that also tells you about the solution as well? It's like, it seems to be a better way to deal with it, but we'll talk more about that shortly. Now, it's interesting about this idea of the oppressed, because by putting this concept of class hatred, whether it's real or imagined, isn't new. Obviously, this what we're talking about is a long time ago, but the phenomenon has been observed throughout history and throughout the world. So one Brazilian philosopher and educator, Paulo Freire, noted, the oppressed, instead of striving for liberation, tend themselves to become oppressors. Their ideal is to be men, but for them to be men is to be oppressors. So when you erroneously put people into classes that all men are the oppressors and all women are the oppressed, then you erroneously make that your targeter of what to become. And similarly, Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century Muslim philosopher, he also observed this dynamic and suggested that this imitation inadvertently reinforced the idea of the superiority of the perceived oppressor. So this philosopher Ibn Khaldun stated, the vanquished always seek to imitate their victors in their dress, their insignia, their belief, and other customs and usages. And this is because men are always inclined to attribute perfection to those who have defeated and subjugated them, either because the reverence they feel for their conquerors makes them see perfection in them, or because they refuse to admit that their defeat could have been brought about by ordinary causes, and hence they suppose that it is due to the perfection of the conquerors. Should this belief persist for long, it will change into a profound conviction and will lead to the adoption of all the tenets of the victors and the imitation of all of their characteristics. And this imitation may come about either unconsciously or because of a mistaken belief that the victory of the conquerors was due not to their superior solidarity and strength, but due to the inferiority of the customs and beliefs of the conquered. Hence arises the further belief that such an imitation will remove the causes of defeat. So there are, of course, some serious problems with these dogmas, with the idea of imitating the oppressor, and it makes feminism in these ways incapable of liberating women, and instead it makes it incumbent on women in this imitation game to have to be successful career women and to belittle women who choose to be full-time parents, to belittle them as somehow not achieving their full potential and letting society down by embracing what may be considered a traditional female role. Simone de Beauvoir, who some of you may have heard for, is a bit of an older feminist thinker, but whose works continue to be used and inspired from by modern feminists. She was one of the ones who catapulted the feminist movement, explained with regards to this, this housewife denigration of the housewife, no woman should be authorized to stay at home to raise her children. Women should not have that choice, precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make that one. It's a way of forcing women in a certain direction. So there's this arbitrary imitation of men and this arbitrary denigration of what a woman may want to do. And you know, the question is, can this really make women happier? Some studies show that, for example, women in, and this isn't always the case, but this particular study showed that women in business leadership roles were reported as 47% more likely to suffer from depression than men in similar jobs. And, you know, it's just a question whether this imitation, arbitrary imitation, can it really make women happier? And just as an aside on, you know, people often bring this up with regards to Islam, that why should, the woman's worth or virtue be defined by her actions towards her husband. First of all, they're defined by her actions towards God, not towards her husband. But in the same breath, the Prophet ﷺ reminded men that the best amongst you is those who are best to their wives. So the men's virtue and goodness was defined by how they treated their women. So it's not a one-way street by any means. Now, similar to this intellectual void of secular feminism, advocates of what is being called a feminist Islam, and I use that with heavy air quotes, commonly assert that because it's a matter of human interpretation, there's no single authentic, authoritative or objective version of Islam. I hear this quite a lot, maybe you have heard it too. And there's reams and reams written about this by feminists, that there's no single authentic, authoritative or objective version of Islam, and that for according to these feminists, it's dangerous to assert that there is one. And such feminist advocates will lament the phrase, Islam is, and even the Quran says. For them, there is no Islam is or the Quran says, because it is not one thing, and it does not say one thing according to them. In other words, the claim put forth by many Muslim feminists is that there's no one interpretation of the will of God. And in arguing this, such a claim attempts to make room for or legitimize the existence of a feminist reading of Islam. And we'll look at why that in itself is problematic. However, this argument that there is no authoritative version of Islam, first of all, it's counterproductive even for feminist advocates. Because if there's no one authoritative interpretation of Islam and any and all interpretations are equally valid, then on this basis, a feminist interpretation would be just as valid as a misogynistic or patriarchal interpretation. If there's no authoritative version to arbitrate, then you have no grounds on which to propose their own reading. Now, feminists may respond that others exploit this opportunity for their own ends. They may say that because they're exploiting it, in their view, misogynistic scholars are exploiting it for their ends. Their interpretations should not be given any credence. So because there's no authoritative interpretation, we shouldn't give credence to these men. But if there's no authoritative version, as I said, then who has a mandate to declare who is sincere in their interpretation and who is not? And who has a mandate to condemn another with the charge of exploiting Islam for their own purposes? Now, not only does the claim that Islam is open to any interpretation, it unjustly reduces a very sophisticated body of theological sciences to as vague and hokum a process as reading tea leaves. It's like it can mean anything. What do you see in the clouds? It's like anything. But the use of this assertion, it backfires and leaves even the foundations of a feminist theology no more credible than those, for example, of violent terrorists, accused misogynists, and even fascists. If it can mean anything, it can mean anything. If feminists have relegated the will of God to possibly meaning anything that can be imagined based on one's disposition, then just like the Rorschach ink blot test, it's simply the case that the loudest voice wins out. Now, unlike Islam, feminism doesn't have a specific holy book. It doesn't have a Quran. It doesn't have a code or a canon. It doesn't even have an authoritative body to arbitrate what is authentically feminism and what is not feminism. Now, this leaves us with the absurd but accurate realization that feminism is more unclear, confused, and subject to interpretation than it can ever claim to be the case with Islam. And in light of this, one should fail to see the use of trying to see into muddy waters by using muddy glasses. It's just, it's not the path to clarity. Of course, the premise of the Quran, the premise that the Quran is somehow vulnerable to multiple interpretations is itself false. The Quran, which describes itself as mubin or clear, it may be open to interpretations in many details, but it can't be open to any interpretations, nor can it be open to interpretations that contradict its most clearly conveyed or apparent meanings. To argue otherwise is to argue that God is a bad communicator who cannot correctly express his intent. For example, one can't argue that the Quran advocates polytheism, any more than one can argue that, as a general rule, the Quran doesn't give 2/3 of inheritance to males. No matter how skilled your mental gymnastics may be, those verses say what they say. You remember how I referred to the Medinan verses as being legal and clear and prescriptive, whereas the Makki verses were more poetic and a bit more thought-inducing and a bit more, you could say those were a little, those were not designed to give clear prescriptions, but those were for you to think and ponder over and interpret. So there are general rules that are stipulated either in the Quran or in the Hadith as being general, and exceptions to the general rules are stipulated in the Quran or the Hadith as being exceptions to the general rule. The exception is never phrased as the general rule. You have the general rule and then you have exceptions on certain circumstances. So many of the clear prescriptions and proscriptions in the Quran are straightforward, and being general commands, they're not specific to a particular context, they're just general commands. And any ambiguities that do arise are usually from the details or from some of those exceptions that I mentioned. And to find the explanations for those, we look, for example, at the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which we look to provide clarification for those. Now, it should be noted that for many feminists, it's also unacceptable that legal interpretation should be the exclusive remit of jurists. And they may say, for example, that if you say that it's only for jurists, you're saying that jurists are infallible. It is, however, easy to point out the obvious, that it is because all human intellect is accepted as being infallible that it's considered necessary that the job of legal interpretation is done by those that satisfy at least a minimum intellectual criteria. It's because we know that human beings are infallible that we reserve that task for those who are equipped to do that job. It's not something that not everybody can issue a fatwa. Now, one of the primary claims of feminists who engage in the interpretation of Islamic texts is that male voices have drowned out the will of God. According to these claims, Islamic scholarship has been a male-dominated or patriarchal enterprise that has either deliberately or incidentally subordinated and deprived women of their due rights. One contemporary academic, Dr. Shuruq Najib, for example, states, when Muslim women stand before the Quran to hear the divine discourse, they also hear the voices of male interpreters, and that to hear the Quran without the mediation of men, some Muslim feminists choose to suppress the male voices in order to recover what they perceive to be an originally liberating and egalitarian divine message. Now, first of all, it's unclear how this muting of the male voice would be achieved. How would you mute the male voice, and how would such a muting, what would that result in? The Quran doesn't speak of its own accord when it's not read or recited. And if male voices are biased, why is it believed that female voices will necessarily and infallibly produce an egalitarian divine message? Are female voices or interpretations considered by such feminists to be superior to men's in what is essentially an intellectual endeavour? Now, it's argued that male readings remain incomplete due to the absence of a female reading. But then, are female readings similarly incomplete? Or are they somehow then complete? Are they deified and somehow considered to be all-knowing? Now, to claim that having a particular gender produces distortion in intellectual endeavours is itself a sexist claim. Understanding scripture doesn't require particular gender or chromosomes, male nor female. It requires intellect, and that's something that both men and women have been given and have been instructed to use. Now, unless the feminist proposition is in to some way start from scratch, to start afresh, it's unclear how such feminists propose to arbitrarily without reason filter out only the male voices from the intellectual heritage of Islam. Now, historically, Islam hasn't considered the gender of interpreters in of itself to be an important feature, but rather only the quality of the interpretation and its accuracy to the text has been considered the most important feature. Consider, for example, that and many of this will be familiar to you, hopefully, but consider that the heritage of intellectual Islam, and I'm sorry to revise this again, but why not? It boasts highly accomplished and renowned scholars in the thousands who just happen to have been female. The contemporary Sheikh Akram Nadwi has documented at least 8,000 female scholars across global history, and that's just in the field of hadith sciences, the sciences of narrating the life and saying and tacit approvals of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, because Islam doesn't make a differentiation between male and female intellects, both male and female students are reported in our heritage to having congregated to learn from these intellects. Sometimes they would even crowd around a female scholar's home to learn from her. Notable male scholars are reported to have taken knowledge from female scholars, including Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Dhahabi, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Imam Abu Hanifa, and even the Caliph Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. They're all reported to have taken knowledge in some way from female scholars. In the past cities of Central Asia, and I'm bringing this up also because of the accusation of the male voice drowning out everything else. In the past cities of Central Asia, it's reported that the legal opinion or fatwa would only be issued from a house if it also had the signatures of the householder and his daughter, his wife, or his sister. So that's how widespread Islamic understanding and knowledge was, not just amongst men, but but that's how widespread it was amongst women, and it wasn't because they were women, it wasn't considered a novelty, they just happened to be women. It was the norm. So not only have female scholars undeniably played a prominent and critical role in development of Islamic law and Sharia as we know it today, but Islamic courts were so renowned for guaranteeing justice for women that even as recent as during the Ottoman Caliphate, even women of other religious communities preferred to have their matters dealt with in Islamic courts, even though they had access to courts of their own religion. So even though Jewish, Christian, and any other women had access to their own religious courts, many of them preferred to go to Islamic courts because they felt that they were more just to the women's plight than their own courts. There's even instances where female scholars held opinions which might be considered, if we looked at them now, to be disadvantageous to herself as a woman. And whilst her legal opinion was considered valid, other male scholars would take alternative legitimate opinions that were more advantageous to the woman. So, for example, it's reported that Fatima bint Qais used to narrate a tradition in which the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, advised her that in her particular situation, her ex-husband did not have an obligation to cover her expenses after they were divorced. So this advice was given to her particularly, and she used to narrate this tradition. Now, there are discussions amongst other scholars around the particular circumstances of her case, what those circumstances were that would have caused the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to tell her this. Now, whilst the reliability of her narration is not considered questionable, in fact, as far as I understand, there are no female narrators whose narrations are considered questionable. What is interesting is that many others, including Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Zayd ibn Thabit, and numerous later scholars and jurists, they all held that divorced women were entitled to receive upkeep, and they based this on other legitimate evidences. With Aisha, the wife of radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Aisha, to whom is attributed a vast corpus of hadith narrations, she provided details as to why Fatima bint Qais' particular case was treated the way it was. So despite the fact that Fatima bint Qais knew that this particular hadith could be considered detrimental to her own position, because it's saying that she's not entitled to upkeep after she's divorced, she earnestly narrated it. And further, despite the opportunity that many male jurists have had since then to exploit that narration and apply it to all women, which is what one might expect them to do if they were truly male biased and conspiratorial in that sense, male scholars have opted for the opinions which are more advantageous to the woman. So are these the male voices that feminists would deem to be silenced or need to be filtered out in a feminist ideology? Now, conversely or ironically, Muslim feminists will quite readily employ those male voices if those male voices happen to align with feminist ideals. So, for example, the oft-cited works of Qasim Amin is just one. For example, Ziba Mir Husseini, who is a feminist and she's a lecturer at SOAS, she describes the male reformists Tahir al-Haddad, Fazlur Rahman and Nasser Abu Zaid as being, quote, the backbone of feminist scholarship in Islam, which is taking reformist thought into new ground. So these are male voices, but these male voices are okay because they happen to agree with whatever they want them to say. So the feminist assertion that they're trying to eliminate male bias from Islamic scholarship in effect results in a redacting of many of the female voices from Islamic history, and it ends up being an obstruction to the objective considerations of justice. And this points instead to a drive to affirm feminist ideals first. So the feminist ideals take precedent, whether those voices, whether it's through voices that are male or female. So a feminist theology, again heavily air quoted, it becomes merely a filter for selected content, and it's not about the gender of the voices, or supposedly about discovering the voice through which the will of God is truly expressed, but rather it's about expressing the will of feminism in the loudest voice. Now, it has to be borne in mind in when we are looking at this, that the purpose of Islam, of theology, of understanding our religion, of understanding and studying the Quran and the Hadith, the purpose is the study of God and His will. It's to understand His will in how we should live. It's not for merriment or play. It's not just for the fun of it. It's not just for an amusement or pastime. It's so that we can try to understand the will of God, not understand our own will through it. So it's about the will of the Creator, not the will of the created. It would follow then that unless feminist Islam or feminist theology is concerned, unless it's concerned with studying the will of God alone, then it won't fulfill the purpose of studying Islam at all. Basically, it's just a self-fulfilling kind of study. So, whilst theology can be understood as the study of God and His will, feminism seems to be about, and we'll see why very shortly, about the human will of feminists. So a feminist theology ultimately, it tries to usurp the narrative that theology may provide between man and God, or woman and God, and prioritizes the will of man or woman over the will of God. And that very phenomenon, prioritizing human will over that of the Creator, that can be the very same cause of the societal oppression that we see today. Now, this so-called notion of a feminist Islam, it also presupposes the idea that wherever there is some compatibility, first of all, it presupposes the idea that there is some compatibility between feminism and Islam. By joining these two words, feminism and Islam, feminist Islam, it's suggesting that they easily click together. It's not a big deal, easy as. But we can see from feminist reformists that they themselves have overtly stated and overtly realized that certain feminist ideas simply cannot be satisfied through interpretation of texts. First of all, they can't find it in the basic interpretation of Islam, the straightforward. They can't even establish it, and I'll give some examples, through reinterpreting those sources. Even if they interpret it without any kind of restriction and they're left to interpret it however they want, they still cannot match them up with some of their feminist ideals. The mere fact that some people choose to call themselves Muslim feminists is not proof that Islam and feminism are compatible. It's merely proof that human beings are capable of cognitive dissonance. That's all that it is proof of. One of the greatest ironies is that such feminists will regularly affirm through their own work, as I mentioned, that feminism and Islam are not compatible, and I will give some quotes shortly. They're not compatible unless Islam changes to fit feminist ideas, rendering the notion of a feminist Islam or a feminist theology an impossible one, let alone being anything of use. It just seems to be, to confirm their own, just to reassure themselves, this could be what Islam says, so I'll be happy with living according to these principles. For example, Aisha Chowdhury, another academic feminist, openly advocates the cherry picking of hadith, arguing that since the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is at the same time depicted, she argues that he's depicted as being both a radical egalitarian man and at the same time a patriarchal man who belonged and was comfortable in 7th century Arabia. And because of this, Aisha Chowdhury claims that one could choose which traditions, which hadith to choose from, to adopt from. She asks readers to take advantage of the pliable nature of prophetic reports. She states, in employing Prophet Muhammad's prophetic practice selectively to support a gender egalitarian vision of Islam, Muslim feminists would be doing exactly what Muslim scholars did when using prophetic practice to support patriarchal perspectives of Islam. And Keisha Ali builds on this and also argues that contemporary believers are permitted to adopt prophetic practice when this practice conforms to what she defines as contemporary ethics, but to repudiate it when it contradicts them. Now, these are well-known, central, self-defined Islamic feminists. These are not fringe. These are not some kind of wacky people that I found in the comment section of YouTube. These are people who publish the works that exist on Islamic feminism. Now, we've already observed above the problem that this approach runs into. Now, if according to feminists there's no authoritative version of Islam, first of all, who has a mandate to filter the prophetic tradition in any way? Certainly not feminists. And Muslim feminists may simply respond that this is, it's merely about allowing the discourse or the conversation to occur. Oh, we're just allowing the conversation to develop. It's not serious. We're just exploring. We're not imposing a particular interpretation. Again, not only would this thought experiment be of no utility, but the entire response is disingenuous. Feminists like Chowdhury state that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, they state that he did the best he could to create gender egalitarianism, but without fulfilling this vision in his lifetime. In other words, they're saying it was an incomplete mission. More specifically and explicitly, Fatima Mernissi writes, is it possible that Islam's message had only a limited and superficial effect on a deeply superstitious 7th century Arabs who failed to integrate its novel approaches to the world and to women? Is it possible that the hijab, the attempt to veil women that is claimed today to be basic to Muslim identity, is nothing but the expression of the persistence of pre-Islamic mentality, the Jahiliyyah mentality that Islam was supposed to annihilate? In other words, Chowdhury and Mernissi impute to the Prophet a particular mission that she seems to suggest is up to Muslim feminists to complete. And this is clearly beyond the remit of the theological endeavour to merely understand the will of God. Amina Wadud, a former founder of the feminist organisation Sisters in Islam, claimed that for explicit verses of the Quran, so that was just about the hadith, but what about the Quran? And Amina Wadud claims that for specific verses of the Quran for which feminists could not find alternative explanations, the possibility of rejecting these verses should be considered. And she states, quote, "Personally, I have come to places where how the text says what it says is just plain inadequate or unacceptable, however much interpretation is enacted upon it." And she says further that where particular articulations in the Quran as a text are problematic, there is the possibility of refuting the text, to talk back, to even say no. So she's talking about literally saying no to the text of the Quran. And Umayma Abu Bakr elaborates on this further. She's another feminist writer. She says that whilst previously such researchers have tried to resolve this difficulty by drawing attention to the general principles of the Quran as a frame of reference, Wadud takes the issue to another level in that the letter of the divine text remains a problem and it's time to stop grappling with it. In other words, just let it go. So give up with it. Don't try to make it fit anymore. It's not going to fit. Just say no to it. And she explains that Wadud's perspective would be a means to avoid literal application or implementation of a text when it opposes our current, more progressive human development and understandings. And again, Keisha Ali also suggests that the Quranic text itself requires Muslims to sometimes depart from its literal provisions in order to establish justice. It's any wonder what framework of justice is actually being used. So by constantly demanding that Islam must change, feminists themselves indicate, if not protest, they themselves protest that feminism is not compatible with Islam. And this renders the idea of a feminist Islam to be impossible, let alone to be of any utility. Another issue with this is that when we study the will of God, when we study Islam, it requires us, regardless of gender, to be detached from prejudice, from prejudgment, or any other agenda. And in order to attain the purpose of study, we have to do that with accuracy and truth. However, this task is completely subverted if you bring a set of prejudged conclusions. And feminists often tend to approach Islamic texts with prejudged conclusions about what they want to get out of it or what they want to frame from it. Now, studying the will of God should also include studying God's will about morality. What does God say about morality? That's supposed to be our yardstick for what morality is. And it has to be sourced from this objective truth, because if morality was something that we could just intuit from ourselves, then people wouldn't hold different ideas about what morality is. We wouldn't hold different ideas or differ with each other. We wouldn't even need a court adjudication system, because we would already all be in agreement if it was something that we all just already knew completely and perfectly. We wouldn't need revelation if that were the case. But of course, morality can't be intuited from yourself. And the feminist yardstick for concluding what is moral is not from an objective source like we reach to the Quran and to Allah's guidance as being an objective source, but rather the feminist yardstick for deciding what is moral and what is not is openly admitted as being external from the objective truth of Islam. So for example, Asma Barlas, another prominent feminist, openly declares that her method of determining whether the Quran's teachings are ethical and egalitarian, so she's already decided she wants them to be ethical and egalitarian, is to combine the Quran's view of egalitarian and justice, so she says this, with feminist theories. She's already saying that she's combining. This is now a hybrid. This is now her own amalgamation. This is not about understanding what God says is morality. This is about her seeking confirmation of her own opinions of what morality should be. Ziba Mir Hosseini states that Muslim reformist thinkers have tried to reconcile what they understood to be fundamental principles in Muslim law and ethics with modernist conceptions of justice and gender relations. Again, this is a feminist herself saying this. She's saying that the struggle or the work is about reconciling opposing principles. And others, for example, will use Western conceptions of human rights as their framework, whilst others will make vague references to contemporary ethics, as we've just seen. Now, Amina Wadud talked about the frustration that feminists feel when, as Wadud suggests, they have to pretend to advocate feminism from an Islamic perspective and not a secular liberal one. She writes, for example, she explains, the executive director of Sisters in Islam, Zaina Anwar, once asked, why can't we say we're working for gender from a human rights perspective instead of our earlier claim of working from a gender-inclusive Islamic perspective? Quite honestly, Amina Wadud says, I can understand the frustrations. In other words, these feminists are not acting as interpreters. They're not even acting as reinterpreters, but as secular liberal interpolators, so bringing in secular liberal values into Islamic readings. But where do these secular liberal values lead us? Are they really that harmful? Well, most of us will know some of the answers to this, but just very quickly some examples. In the UK, for example, where we have had hundreds of years of feminism, or at least 100, but the history, follows back much further. Whilst at every stage it's held itself up as being the lighthouse for women everywhere, as being the standard bearer at every stage for how women in the whole world should aspire to live like, it continues to strive. It doesn't have an end vision in sight, and it's led to a lot of unintended consequences. So, for example, there are studies which say, there are some studies which would have said that men receive preferential treatment in the criminal justice system. There are other studies which say women receive preferential treatment in the criminal justice system with lighter sentences, preferential and other preferential treatment. There are discrepancies in studies about preferential domestic violence support and cancer research, despite statistics showing that men are often vulnerable at similar or higher rates. There are all kinds of gender gaps in education, women racing ahead of men at universities and in entry to employment. And it's led to, for example, women being liable to pay alimony to ex-husbands in the event of a divorce. There is so much competing statistics in these areas that it's become simply a numbers game, that who has oppressed who the most. It's not about whether the oppression is wrong to begin with or whether those things are wrong to begin with. It's become a numbers game. It's become a point scoring, who happens to have the upper hand at this time. And it will continue to do so if the same individualistic based solutions continue to be applied. This denial of the mutual legal rights and duties between men and women, for example in marriage, it's led to frustration and isolation for both genders. Some have said it's led to rising divorce rates, and we've already mentioned the compulsion to have to work in this economic environment, to have to dress in a certain way, to be validated by society. There is a phenomenon of, because it's said that men can now, it's easier for them to have relationships with women without any legal commitment. So there is a movement of men, it's called going the other way. It means that they're no longer interested in marriage because they don't need it. They can get whatever they need anyway. One could almost argue that if anything, men would probably be happier here in the West right now than they would be in the so-called patriarchal Muslim countries. And For example, domestic violence also continues to exist in shocking proportions, including against men, children, amongst same-gender couples, amongst female couples, amongst male couples. It's not just. People are starting to realise that this is not just one gender oppressing another. This is the result of social chaos. So is this the kind of secular liberal worldview that these Muslim feminists are opening the door for in the Muslim world? Some may think that they are benignly using the terminology as a force for good, as a way to raise awareness, not realising all of the baggage that this brings with it. And instead of reviving the classical Islamic understanding and inspiring creative Muslim thinkers, the result of this feminist undertaking is the further stripping away of the Islamic mechanics and safeguards for justice. So rather than guiding Muslim societies out from their post-colonial condition, the feminist undertaking looks like it's trying to complete the colonial project by pushing for increased imitation of these Western ideologies. And the effect is that the Quran is being used to bring Muslims towards secular liberalism in the same way that some missionaries of other religions, for example, some Christian missionaries will use the Quran to try to bring Muslims towards Christianity. So they will use some of those verses to try to bring Muslims out from Islam and to Christianity. And in the same way, one could argue that the Quran is being used in the same way to bring Muslims towards secular liberalism. Now, given that we talked about, we defined individualism and how it's one of the maxims, one of the main ideals held by liberal feminists, maximizing one's own autonomy. Islamic law, on the other hand, recognizes that no human being is an island unto himself. We don't give birth to ourselves. We don't wean ourselves. We don't raise ourselves. We can't continue to exist without depending on others or on the environment. We can't learn language, speech, or communication. So Islam seeks to facilitate the mutual reliance that is inevitable between people by establishing reciprocal rights and duties between us. This includes between men and women, the poor and the poor and the rich, the strong and the weak, the young and the old, any. And any advantages that happen to be conferred upon one member of society, it comes with the commensurate accountabilities and responsibilities, like we talked about those on the upper deck of the boat. Anytime you have an advantage, you are accountable for that advantage. And weaknesses are supposed to be accommodated for with rights. So the idea of leadership or power, for example, in Islam is not in of itself a virtue to be sought after. Power itself is not something that is considered good to pursue. It's considered to be, something that, it is corruptible. And the one who seeks power in Islam is meant to be the one who is shunned from it, who is kept away from power, because they are likely to be the ones that are corruptible. So Islam recognizes that power is a position of, is an undesirable position of responsibility and accountability. If someone has an authority over you, whether it's a male head of the house, whether it's your boss, whether it's the ruler, it's on their heads basically, and they have to answer for that. It's not something to be envied. It's not an honor or a privilege. And it's through this that, that equality between people is preserved. So whether you are a housewife, whether you are an engineer, whether you are the ruler of a nation, in Allah's eyes, your accountability is going to be the same. You are accountable for your responsibilities, whatever they may be. And God, in the Quran, Allah repudiates those who consider themselves to be self-sufficient. And reveals by way of example that mankind is not going to be called to account for our deeds just individually. It's not just going to be a one-to-one between, you standing before your Creator. But the Quran narrates that we're going to be called to account for our deeds in the hereafter in nations. So it's all going to be exposed and everyone's going to be accounted together, not merely by yourself. And the wrongdoers, as we've seen earlier, they'll argue with each other, blaming one another. So they are there together. They're not there by themselves. So this idea of being self-sufficient, and it's just between me and God. It's not just between you and God, because God has given those provisions to guide you as to how to behave with other people. And so the Quran provides that the burdens that you bear on the day of resurrection won't just be your own, but also those who you may have misguided. And also the rewards will not just be your own, but you'll also reap rewards for those who you may have guided. So it's not just an individual, existence where everything else is as if it were a hologram and everyone else is part of the game. Everybody is being tested together. And one can only wonder, this obsession with individualism and autonomy and self-sufficiency. One can only wonder how much autonomy these Muslim feminists think that any of the prophets of Islam had when they were charged with the duty of revelation. One of the hardest, as we've read the difficulties that they bore when they were charged with the duty of revelation. And one can only wonder how much autonomy such feminists think that Maryam alayhi salam had when she was charged with the duty of bearing Isa alayhi salam in her womb. Was that an act of self-sufficiency and self-determination and autonomy? It was subjecting herself to the will of God. So we cannot bring these concepts. They contradict with what Islam teaches us about our existence and our purpose. And whilst feminism popularly advocates, some of you may have heard the term intersectionality, the idea that a problem, the diagnosis of a problem can't just be looked at through gender, but there's multiple things going on. Now, not only is the feminist idea of intersectionality an admission that feminism itself is deficient in understanding these situations, but it further fails to appreciate the interconnectedness and checks and balances that exist in the solutions that Islam presents. So in the Sharia, the solutions are, if you want to call them intersectional, fine, but they are interconnected essentially, and they are hinged on one another. But it's due to this shallowness in thinking and assessing the worth of individuals in materialistic terms, which is why, and I won't go too much into this due to time, but why people think that the differences in inheritance is somehow a monetary reflection of a person's worth. Inheritance has nothing to do with a person's worth. It's about the practical considerations of life, and there are certain circumstances in which it is divided in the way that the Quran says, and there are certain exceptions in which it is divided differently. These amounts don't pertain to the value of the human being. We don't materialistically value people by how much money they have. This may be an ailment of secular society, but it's not one that comes comes into Islam. So this means that this individualism and this failure to see the foresight in the Islamic solutions means that for feminists who need to argue that Islam is male biased, they can't explain why in Islam a woman, for example, has a right over her husband's time, over her husband's money, and even over his body. So they also, therefore, cannot accept the Islamic rulings on inheritance, spousal obligations, rulings on family leadership and modesty and so on, because to accept those, they would have to accept that there is a dependence between the two. And by constantly demanding that Islam has to change, feminists are openly admitting that it's not compatible with Islam. All we've seen, all I've encountered when I study this is them saying that it's not compatible and Islam has to change. So how can we have this concept of Islamic feminism when Islamic feminists themselves continually propound the fact that they are not compatible? This isn't me saying it. This is Islamic feminists themselves saying this. Now, the Prophet, because I'm conscious of time, how much time do you think I could squeeze out of this? Because okay, inshallah, that should be all right. Now, interestingly, the Prophet ﷺ, many of you may be familiar with the hadith, each one of you is a shepherd and each one of you will be asked about your flock. So a ruler is also a shepherd. He will be asked about his flock. Every man is a shepherd to his family. Every woman is the custodian of her husband's house and children. So each one of you is a shepherd and each one will be asked about his flock. Now, in Islam, when a ruler is given authority over people, he's not given leeway and sovereignty to do whatever he wants. This is not like House of Cards where you can just, make it up as you go along, you get into power and you can do whatever you want. Rather, in Islam, when authority is given to someone, sovereignty remains with God. And the authority given carries with it a duty it doesn't carry with it a freedom, it carries with it a duty to implement God's law. So if a man is given authority over his family, he is not given sovereignty. He can't do something that is haram, he can't do something that is forbidden, he can't do something that he just wants to do that has no basis in Islam. The authority is a duty to implement God's law. So the authority is in reality a responsibility. And as we mentioned before, the authority comes with accountability. And in order for accountability to exist, that person has to have had the authority. Because if they don't have the authority, how can they be held to account? They can say, well, I couldn't help it. It was just, you didn't tell me I was in charge. You didn't tell me it was my job to do this. But in order to be accountable, that authority has to be there. Now, some of the feminists I've mentioned earlier, they will dispute this concept of authority and they would advocate increased power for women. So for example, Amina Wadud, Asma Barlas and Fatima Mernissi, they variously argue that Islam doesn't prevent women, they would argue, from taking roles as the leader. And they would argue that even in one household, both the male and the female can have equal authority. Now, the idea of male authority or responsibility over women appears to them to be an affront to the feminist autonomy or to individualism. And Wadud and Asma Lamrabit, they argue that the Islamic injunction for a wife to obey her husband in what is permitted and what is the Sharia and what is halal, they argue that this obedience that the wife has to give to her husband contradicts the oneness of God. They argue that this contradicts Tawheed, as they claim that obedience is for God alone. This is absurd, because if obedience to the husband constitutes idolatry, then according to such feminists, a child, a boy obeying his mother would also be idolatry, a citizen abiding by the law would also be idolatry, and a Muslim obeying the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, which the Quran explicitly commands, would also be idolatry. So these are very wacky arguments to counter the idea of male authority, and it's arbitrarily or just blindly because it happens to be a male in power. But in fact, the idea of authority itself is irrelevant whether it's with a male or a female. That authority is charged with fulfilling God's law. Then it doesn't matter whether it is a man that happens to be doing that role. In effect, you are absolved from that responsibility yourself. You have other responsibilities to be accountable for. And if they don't abide by those principles, you are then responsible to take them to account for that. So if they fail in their job, you don't just sit back and let them, do whatever they're doing. Then you become responsible to account them, as you are responsible to account a tyrannical ruler who is also committing injustice. It's the same thing. So there's also this feminist attempt to interpolate the concept of musawa, or the Arabic word now used for equality, into readings of the Quran. And they use this in what can be seen as an attempt to align the Quran with the Western conception of equality, which is different from the Islamic notion of equity between us, or how that works in Islam. Now, where does this obsession for absolute equality come from? Are we all biologically identical? No. Do any two people, regardless of gender, let's put gender aside for now, do any two people have equal strength, weakness, or ability? No. Equality doesn't exist in nature. So why does any ideology, including feminists, think that humans should suddenly be leveled and forced into homogeneous boxes and have equal or have the exact same or similar rights and needs? And this is something that feminists themselves realized. They realized this themselves, despite clamoring for equality to the extent that they did. They realized when they saw that equal treatment of men and women still didn't yield the so-called equal outcomes they had hoped for. It didn't work. Even in meritocratic environments, for example, women still tend to prefer, according to many studies, they still tend to prefer a work-life balance that involves less hours than men. And many tend to prefer leaving their careers to pursue motherhood and family. And yet feminists seem to be either ignoring or hiding this reality by claiming that women are forced to make those choices due to supposed continuing gender discrimination. The reality is men and women, for example, also do not walk away from adult relationships on an equal footing. And instead of calling for better or contractual safeguards for women, Feminism has instead empowered women to have casual relationships without commitment, leaving women quite literally holding the baby. And you see, feminists continue to and have demanded the full suite of, and I'm using the secular Western feminists here as an example because so many of the Islamic feminists seem to be heading in this direction. Feminists demanded the full suite of reproductive rights for women, such as the right to decide whether to keep the child, whether to abort or give away their children to somebody else, and reserves only the financial obligations for men. So they get to make all the decisions about that, and men get to pay for whatever it is they happen to decide upon. So according to you know, these the society that has been influenced by feminism, a woman has an automatic right to her children regardless of whether she's married or not, but imposes a financial obligation on the man to pay child support without giving him any right to even have a relationship with his biological child, let alone deciding in whether, you know, the reproductive stage, without even guaranteeing a right to a relationship. It's like, in effect, to put it, you know, crassly, a tax without representation. It's just to provide the money and nothing else. So is this the kind of equal rights that, that we are being invited towards? Many of you know, and I'm not going to go into too much on this, but, you know, female quotas for certain jobs. For example, the nice polished jobs with the, you know, in the boardrooms and the suits and things like that, but not the same kind of quotas for, you know, for the unpleasant jobs like garbage collection and animal slaughter and coal mining and bomb disposal. We've talked about that a lot in the past, so, I mean, hopefully most of you should be familiar with those things. But furthermore, feminism, and because we've talked about it a little bit on the economic side of it, feminism can't actually liberate people from these injustices that are caused by capitalism, this necessity, this created necessity to push women out to go to work. Feminism doesn't have an alternative economic solution. Even if you had an all-female society where men were doing exactly as they were told, you would still have, in a capitalist society, a large unjust gap between the rich and the poor. And because there's no alternative system posited by feminism for this, all they're really arguing for is equal representation in an already unjust system, a piece of the pie, essentially. So rather than standing for social justice and challenging the economic system that has enslaved millions of people in debt, all they've done is served up women for exploitation too. This is why feminism is often known as the handmaiden of capitalism, and made it necessary for women to work and pay taxes and you know, become part of this system. Now, the powerful elite gets to enslave, exploit and tax the female half of society as well, and this is considered progress. So it's essentially mutated into outright female privilege, a type of a gender sectarianism, demanding more of the privileges for less of the responsibilities. Now, it's ironic that you know, if it's supposed to be a response to injustices, it seems to have adopted the same modus operandi of its own perceived oppressors. It didn't really, as I said, liberate them from an oppressive system, but rather just gave them a stake in it. And this doesn't really sound like a movement that can truly provide guidance for women. Now, the Quran, interestingly, doesn't use that word that I mentioned, musawa. It doesn't use that word musawa, equality, or its derivatives. It only uses a similar word when it's saying that things are not equal. So the Quran says not equal are belief and disbelief. But the Quran doesn't use that word equal to describe human beings. In fact, the Quran recognizes that people are not given the same provisions, and in the afterlife that people are going to be ranked and rewarded differently. So people are not promised equality but justice instead in the Quran, not a blanket equality like communism that just ignores any kind of difference. Now, very quickly, because I'm very conscious of the time, I had so much to say and I still have a little bit more. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for those of you that are still here. Now, some sisters, and this is really important, they seem to be waging battles today over merely using the language of feminism. So words like calling themselves a feminist and using the word misogyny to describe problems that exist. And in doing so, as I mentioned earlier, they leave the door ajar to the ideology of feminism and all of those strains and the intellectual and academic direction, the trajectory that is going to. Now, I mentioned earlier that not only this, but calling it misogyny is letting people off too lightly, and it doesn't provide an explanation for what's really going on. It doesn't say anything really about the genuine cause of the problem. And as I said, instead of calling out misogyny when there is a case of blatantly a woman being deprived her specific rights as a woman, not just generally her Islamic rights, which a man has as well, but her specific rights, which as only a woman gets, instead of calling that misogyny, more powerful is to call out the fact that it is un-Islamic and that it is ignorance. Because when you do that, you remind the person of their obligation. You don't put them off automatically and have them turn away from you and start to accuse you of things of following deviant ideologies. When you use the correct language, you are pointing immediately to something that they cannot hide from, which is an Islamic prescription that they are failing to abide by. So I would advocate that instead of using the term misogynistic, which seems to be on the rise for some reason, it's unhelpful. Rather call them out for what it really is. It's un-Islamic. Instead of calling ourselves feminists, which again doesn't do justice to what we are as Muslims, we are a whole lot more than that. Just call yourselves Muslims, because this is the best da'wah and the best reminder to others of what the system of Islam offers in these situations. Now, some of the basic things that Islam provides for women, I trust that a lot of you know those things, which is why I haven't spent too much time on that. I wanted to go beyond that. I wanted to talk about specifically what Islamic feminists say. But very briefly, feminism, for example, as a comparison, it doesn't give any critical rights. It doesn't guarantee or define any critical rights that women can expect from her marriage partner, for example, whereas Islam already has that. It has to be implemented, but it's already defined and understood, and from divine wisdom it's determined that that is the best right that you could possibly have. Feminism doesn't have any critical rights that women can expect from her marriage partner. Islam, on the other hand, gives women the rights to have her human needs fulfilled by her partner in marriage. Feminism and its individualistic basis doesn't offer these. Some of these rights, for example, that Islam includes the right to respect, affection and time from her husband, the right to physical satisfaction by her husband, the right to shelter provided by her husband, the right to food and clothing equal in quality to her husband, the right to physical protection provided by her husband, and the right to a dowry and alimony. One man asked the Prophet ﷺ, "What do you command about our wives?" And he replied, "Give them food from what you have for yourself, clothe them by that which you clothe yourself, do not beat them and do not insult them." So all these things point to the respect and the good maintenance. You all know about Islam's woman's worth in Islam is by her virtue. It's not by her appearance or all of the things that Western society posits as being the bearers of, or the markers for women's success. The one thing about this is the fact that Islam values you based on character, is that everyone has a shot, no matter, and it's a fair shot. No matter if you were born with a disability, no matter if you are born with every talent and you can't decide what to do with that, no matter if you are, so accomplished, no matter if you feel downtrodden in life, Islam allows women to pursue the worship and obedience to Allah through any pathway she wants. Any pathway, through being businesswomen, CEOs, political ministers, even join the army, even though it's not obligatory. Whatever pathway you want, Islam will judge you based on your character and your and discharging that duty, the duty that you had as a Muslim. You don't automatically get points for being, a businesswoman if you were a horrible person otherwise, or if you were not kind to your family. And because Islam caters for and provides a conducive environment to pursue motherhood, women are not forced to undertake work to support themselves. And this is there. This the environment is there to facilitate motherhood and family, because most women tend to become mothers at some point in their lives, and so this is something that has to be accommodated for in a system that claims it can provide, all the solutions to your life. However, there are exceptional ways to live, and there are other ways to live that Islam also provides for, but it provides for this because it's the most common thing, and it rewards that, and it doesn't denigrate that at all. In fact, it elevates it, as many of you know. So very, very briefly, I want to give one example. I have a lot more, but I'm just going to give one because I'm conscious of time. And it's about applying. And I mentioned at the beginning, knowing the rules and listing the rules is different, and applying and having the understanding of the wider wisdom is different. I mentioned about, the woman has a right to be provided for. How can that happen if there's economic poverty, etc., etc. So you should all have in your minds the fact that this is all interconnected. Now, let's take the issue, for example, of masjids and the frequent complaints we have about the lack of space for women. Now, we often hear about, there are so many masjids. There's often, though they're designed to accommodate for men, and sometimes, or very frequently as is reported, the space for women is either small or it's inappropriate. I think I read the other day about a sister who was asked to pray in the mosque kitchen, which was funny. Not funny. Not funny. Let's take that issue, right? So now a simplistic approach to the problem would be to demand that mosques need to make more space for women. We hear this, mosques need to make more space for women. However, perhaps a more enlightened approach, perhaps could be, if we consider the problem more broadly. Now, is the issue with the masjid one of space for prayer? Is it that there's not enough space, or is it because of the understanding of the function of a mosque itself? Now, in reality, a masjid is not only a place for prayer, but a community hub. If it were only a place for prayer, then you could understand why, because it's obligatory on men to pray Jamaat for the Friday prayers, that in those circumstances, you give priority to who it is an obligation on. However, generally, Muslim women are not to be stopped from going to the masjid to pray. If it was an issue of space and there wasn't enough, then surely we would be sensible and say, fine, it is obligatory on them to pray in Jamaat, so the Jamaat spaces should be reserved for them. But in reality, a masjid is not only meant to be a place for prayer, but it's also meant to be a community hub. It's meant to be a place for meeting, a place for learning, for discussing, for deciding about the community's tasks and obligations. And if we campaigned instead for the revival of the traditional function of a masjid as being a place of learning, not just for men and women, but for all, not just for men or just for women, but for both, and for the young and the old, this would open up the mosque to multiple activities, just as they were used historically. And the lack of space for women would resolve itself, because the dynamics of the mosque would revert to being a place of community involvement, open to the entire community, as well as just a place for prayer. So if we want to make mosques accessible for women, we need to make them accessible for all Islamic purposes. Does that make sense? So it's like there is a simplistic approach, which is clamoring against the fact that there is not enough space. But actually, if we look at the overall picture and look a little bit more in a more nuanced way, we see that actually there is another way to approach this problem. Similarly, if we want to tackle or eliminate female poverty, we need to eliminate the causes of poverty itself by challenging, the economic system that brings those about. And for dealing with these problems, we can form action committees. This is what we should be doing on specific issues. But whatever we do, whatever we campaign for, we have to make sure, one, we have diagnosed and understood the problem with the correct lens, and not borrowing a lens that leads us to misdiagnose the problem in the first place. And that when we talk about these problems and raise awareness, we don't use the wrong language about these problems. So we don't use the language of identity group politics that exists, that currently exists in the West. For example, the language of feminism, for example, because not only does this turn people away, as I mentioned, it's incorrect in its diagnosis, and it offers no solution to go along with it. whether it's about campaigning for respect or defending the respect of the hijab and the niqab, whether it's about the rights of citizens here in England, or whether it's the rights of Muslims abroad, we should be active in this, and all Muslims have a duty to be engaged, to seek knowledge on this and to take a role in this, not just to sit back and observe and be a little bit afraid to put ourselves out there. Not everybody has to be a scholar, not everybody has to be a speaker, but everybody has particular talents and skills that they can direct towards these causes. Whether you're better at sciences, or whether you're better at business, whether you're better at graphic design, whether you're excellent with managing people, whether you are better at managing family affairs. For example, and I'm going to end shortly, when I was in Malaysia, I met with a lot of Muslim activist women who had a lot of children. They also had a lot of degrees, masters and PhDs. They also had jobs, and they were also heavily active in the Islamic environment. How were they doing it all effectively? It wasn't through trying to do it all, but it was actually through balancing out the responsibilities. So, for example, they would identify or come to know that one of the younger ones amongst them wanted to become a doctor or a lawyer. They would then help to divert them to make sure that the reason for them wanting to do that was a good reason. And then they would help to gather resources or to manage workloads so that that person could have the ability to do that. If that person, for example, was a mother of however many children, they would coordinate daycare, for example, with their husbands and amongst each other to facilitate this. So by working together, they were able to do it all. They were able to have it all without doing it all, which is the opposite of what many, what is often advocated to us from feminists. I could probably talk about this for another 3 hours, but I'm going to stop. I did have more things to say, but out of respect for your patience, I'm going to stop right there. Jazakallah khair for listening, and inshallah, hopefully another occasion we can expand on this further and discuss further.
Jazakallah khairan. Inshallah, that's an excuse for us to invite you down. So you could add to what you've already given us, mashallah. I think we should take some questions, inshallah. So are there any questions first here, and then I'll take some from if there's any online. Anyone? Yeah, come.
Jazakallah khairan, firstly. Secondly, you mentioned how feminists are desperate, or Muslim feminists are desperate to hold on to the Islamic version of feminism. Yeah. So where you said people like Amina Wadud will openly admit that Islam and feminism don't come together in the way that perhaps they would like.
Mm-hmm.
So why the need to cling on to it so badly? And is this specific to feminism, or is it part of something wider and a wider framework of reformation and of looking at Islam through a secular liberal lens, as you said?
So that's an excellent question. So just to make sure I've understood the question you're asking, why, if it's obvious to them that Islam and feminism conflict, why are they trying to hold on to this, and why do they call it this? There's a number of reasons. One of them is what you hinted at.
A question to that.
Oh yeah, okay.
Because I think it's going to be slightly linked.
Okay.
Okay. So I think we'd agree that secularists reject any laws made by God and any authority that God has over them, and feminists reject any laws made by men and any authority men might have over them. Saying that, we all know Muslims and Islam aren't always the same thing. They are feminists and feminists and feminists are not always the same. How should we tackle the issue that there are many sisters who think Islamically but couch their language within the vernacular of feminists? After all, on the flip side, we see many secular Muslims use Islamic terms to distort Islam, and we see many useless Islamic terms and are generally falling into Islam.
Yeah, that is tied in.
Yes,
Yeah. So there's two reasons why people do this. It depends also who you're referring to specifically. So, for example, amongst maybe what you might come across on social media, and just generally in your interactions with other sisters around you in your day-to-day life, when they do use the language of feminism, there sometimes is an innocent use of the word, thinking that, oh, it just means equality for men and women. And this is why we need to understand these terms, and when we are doing the work of activism, this is why we need to study the words that we use very carefully, because we unwittingly, as I mentioned during the talk, by using those words, lend purchase to the second category, which I'll explain. We open the door for them to bring in these other ideologies. It becomes a backdoor way to sort of reform Islam. And this isn't something new. This is something that, colonialists realized a long time ago, that to take control of a society, you had to kind of win over its women, change its women, and make them think that there was something better, because they recognized that the women were the backbone of families and therefore the backbone of societies. And so the ideology of feminism has for a long time, I think Frantz Fanon has written about this as well, and others, or about this more generally. It's been the back door for reformists, for those who wish to reinterpret Islam altogether. And this is why the second category, which is those who do wish to distort it, as I mentioned many of them earlier, using the Quran as a way to bring them out from one, it's like a slippery slope, to bring them out from one path into another and not know when this happened. When did this happen? And because they use the language of the Quran and they use these verses, it leads to a completely contradictory result. But the reason for clinging on to that terminology is because it's so effective. It's so powerful because it has this benign, cuddly face to some. Not to many, it's immediately horrific and they don't like, the terms at all. But to others, it's like, oh, it's just a happy, friendly, term that I can use to let people know that I'm fun and I'm aware and I'm woke. Whereas in reality, it's not a fun word at all. It has terrible consequences. And I was speaking to one sister about this, and I was like, why do you use this word? And she was like, it's catchy. And I said, well, so is Ebola. We don't pursue that. Just because something is catchy, it doesn't mean we need to start using it. In fact, why don't we, as I said, make Muslim the thing to be catchy and to be aspired to? Why does that have to be, the dirty second that we need to clean with words like feminism? Why is that the case? All we're doing when we're doing that, we're not just saying, when people join those two together and say, I'm a Muslim feminist, we've often heard people say, oh, you're saying that Islam is incomplete. You're not just saying that, but you're saying that Islam is secondary. You're saying that you take the name of feminism and you put it in front of your religion. So there is a category of people who I understand and who I've seen to be using the term in a naive manner, not realizing what the repercussions are, using the terms misogyny, using the terms feminism, and there are others who would capitalize on this and exploit this and say, okay, hooked this crowd, let's open this up to them further. You'll see a lot of, for example, some feminists would, they start out just with the simple language. You see the progression. It develops and develops, and then it becomes something unrecognizable. But the nature of the human being, I guess, and if you're raised a Muslim and you're born a Muslim, you don't want to let that go. And so this is, as I mentioned, it's a state of cognitive dissonance, where they don't want to let go of that, even though it is so contradictory, but they don't know how to claw back and how to actually resolve these issues, because by going so far down the rabbit hole, they've kind of distanced themselves from the classical teachings of Islam and the Islamic solutions. And the other thing to point out is that feminism is still not done. They haven't achieved. They're still going. They haven't achieved what it is they think they want to achieve. Every decade or every generation, the goalposts move. Whereas Islam, and you may have heard this before, but it actually achieved its vision, at least in its primary forms, in as little as 23 years. 23 years is not even a lifetime. You could see that in your lifetime. So the idea that somehow, using the word feminism is a quick solution to raise awareness, it's actually not a quick solution. Some people make the same comparisons between, why do you follow such an old religion? It's 1,400 years old. Democracy is a lot older than Islam. It's thousands and thousands. It's a lot older. In comparison, Islam is a lot newer. These are these are silly arguments for people to make. But if we're looking for a genuinely effective solution, one that we have seen works in the past, and one that if we apply it today, not by merely imitating what was done in the past, but applying the method to these new problems. So we're not changing the method, we're using the classical method but applying it to what may be new problems. This is the work that needs to be done, and through this we will find a quicker resolution to many of the issues that we face. And as we've touched upon, it's not just one issue, it's not just women are experiencing X, but it's an infrastructure issue. It's about the whole system being put together in an incorrect way. The Muslim world, for example, is largely secular, or at best it tries to knit in a few aspects of Sharia. And when you do that, you've taken away that balance, that mizan that I was talking about earlier, that Allah set out. You take that away and everything is a mess. And that's why it is a mess. So for Muslims in the Muslim world, who are advocating for the correcting of that structure, who are calling for those in power to change the way that they do things, for them, if they do that, that is the fastest way to alleviate the root causes of these problems and unknit some of the others. So there's essentially two groups. There's the benign and there's the deliberate, and we need to advise both, and we need to be very, very cautious about the language that we use. I mean, it's the word fascism. Does anybody know what that actually means? Apparently, the original meaning is actually not benign, but because it's been turned into this word, we don't suddenly start calling ourselves fascists just because its original meaning was benign. I'm sorry, I forget what it was, but if you can look it up, that would be good, something to do later. I'm
going to take one last question,
okay.
And then if you could just wrap up
your
sure. Message of what you wanted us to take. There's a question online. It says, Islamic history has given us many Islamic role models, but do you feel that our sisters take specific details about the mothers of Islam rather than a holistic view of women? So the business side of Khadija radiallahu anha, or the scholarship of Aisha radiallahu anha, for example, and is this okay?
Sorry, could you repeat the beginning part of the question?
So Islamic history has given us many female role models, but do you feel that our sisters take specific details about the mothers of Islam?
Yes.
Leave, so they choose.
They choose specifics. Yeah.
Leave the other parts of it.
This is also a good question and something which we touched upon. So you don't have to be an aspiring businesswoman in order to be admirable or successful. You don't have to be scholarly minded in order to be successful as a Muslim. It depends on your aptitudes, and throughout Islam this has always been the case. I mean, some of the scholars that I mentioned that Sheikh Akram Nadwi documents, those are just the hadith scholars. But women were active not only in every industry, but also they were the people who were raising the individuals doing this. They were the ones raising the scholars, raising the men. And who in your life is more important to you than your mother? I mean, they played the most important role, and it's it can't be said enough. And as I said, whatever your role is in life, God is not going to account you just based on your job title. It's going to be on the way in which you discharge that duty. So if you were a mother, did you discharge your duty well, or were you neglectful? It's not enough just that you were a mother that suddenly you get brownie points for that. Did you do your job? As a father, did you do your job? As a brother, as a sister, these family relationships, no matter what your role is in life, we're going to be accountable not just for those, but how we deal with other members of our community, our neighbours. There tends to be a focus on these particular roles, and I've noticed that is because these are things which tend to sit well in modern society as secularist views of success. It is, Khadija was a businesswoman, radiallahu anha. Yes, she was, mashallah. That doesn't mean that is the identity of a successful person. And this is why we talked about earlier, the purpose of a Muslim is to live according to Allah's laws, and that is the identity of a successful person, someone who does not stray from that. So yeah, there is definitely and I think it's a little bit unfair, because I remember I went to school with a girl who was, she was so, I've never known somebody who was so sincere and kind and, you know, and loved by everybody. And she would work so hard at school, but no matter how hard she worked, she couldn't get the grades that she wanted. It wasn't for lack of trying, it was just maybe that type of knowledge was not what her aptitude was. She was an intelligent person, just not in those fields. So suddenly, if we then say that, and this is why I try to avoid, for example, saying that women are valued for their intellect, because it's not fair. Women are valued for their characteristics and their virtue. Intellect is something that is, you know, either a skill acquired or it's innate in you. But we often hear that, you know, Muslim women are valued for their intellect and for, you know, for all these other things. But actually, the only thing that matters for any Muslim, male or female, is whether they fulfill their duties as a Muslim, and whether they hold to account, whether they command to good, whether they discourage and forbid evil. So that is something that we need to be more cautious of, along with the language, is the examples that we pull out. I mean, I often hear about, oh, you know, women were warriors, and that's great, but it doesn't mean we have to be a warrior in order to be, you know, in order to be successful now in this day and age, or ever, you know, mashallah, you know, each person has their own triumphs and their own achievements in life. But our ideal should be to understand our purpose for why we do these things. So I was mentioning in Malaysia, for example, when a sister may express that she has a particular interest in a particular field, make sure that that person is doing it for the right reasons, to pursue their duty to God, not just for the fun of it, not pursuing progress for the sake of progress, but pursuing progress for the sake of helping Allah, in Allah's cause, or serving in Allah's cause. So that is the main attribute we need to look at, and that's more to do with sort of the revival of thinking. And again, perhaps a topic for another day, but it's just it's an interesting question and one that we need to think about.
Jazakallah khairan everyone for coming. I just wanted to tell you, we had about 60 viewers online live, and I saw there's about over 4,000 just views, but 60 people watching consistently online as well. So mashallah. As you say, also may Allah reward every single person here today that's made the effort to come, especially with the holidays. I know there's so many things happening, weddings and God only knows. I know people are really busy. We've had people saying, you know, like family problems and things like that have got in the way of them coming. So, you know, may Allah reward you all for coming, and inshallah, you know, you get reward for every step that you made to come here today. And especially to Sister Zara for making the effort to come here and put together this talk and to deliver it for us. And inshallah, we definitely want you back. I want that on recording. Inshallah, that, you know, you're definitely going to come back and you know, tell us more about what you've got to give to us. Mashallah, you know, you're a wealth of knowledge, and may Allah reward you for all your work that you do.
May Allah accept anything that was good today, and anything that's wrong is obviously from me. And also, more than me, Jazakallah khair to you, because I went so over time and you sat patiently and attentively, you know, engaged and listened. So Jazakallah khair. How many hours was that? Times that by the number of people that watched and listened in this room, because that's how many hours was spent on this issue here today. Inshallah, may Allah put benefit in that.
End with the dua.
You please go ahead. Yeah.
ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت. ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا واخطأنا. ربنا لا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا. ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به. واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. آمين.